Detective James Morrison stood at the counter of Quick Stop, a small convenience store tucked in a corner of the city. His eyes, sharp and focused, were fixed on a tall man browsing through the snack aisle. The man wore a gray hoodie and dark jeans, an outfit that matched the description of the armed robbery suspect from the previous night's incident at Peterson's liquor store. Morrison's heart began to race as he processed the sight before him. The moment he'd been waiting for had finally arrived. This could be his big break. For the past 3 months, Morrison had been trying to prove himself as the department's newest detective. At 32, he was one of the youngest to earn the prestigious badge, but his arrest numbers weren't impressive enough to satisfy his superiors. His supervisor, Lieutenant Garcia, had been breathing down his neck all week, reminding him that the department was expecting results. Morrison knew this was his chance to make a name for himself, to prove his worth. He had to act fast. "This is it," Morrison whispered to himself, adjusting the holster on his waist. He had no backup yet, but the suspect was right there in front of him. He couldn't afford to wait any longer. Every second that passed increased the risk of the suspect slipping through his fingers. The man in the hoodie had moved toward the refrigerator section, his back now turned to Morrison. The detective's gaze swept over the man quickly. His height, around 6'2", his athletic build, and the short black hair peeking out from under the hoodie. It was all too perfect, too coincidental to ignore. This was the guy. The description matched exactly, and Morrison couldn't let the opportunity slip away. Without waiting for backup to arrive, Morrison steeled himself and approached the man, his hand resting on the weapon at his side, ready for any sudden movements. His fingers tightened around the grip of his gun, his pulse quickening as the distance between him and the suspect closed. The fluorescent lights above flickered, casting strange shadows across the aisles, adding an eerie layer to the tense atmosphere. Morrison felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was it, the moment that would define his career. "Sir, turn around slowly and keep your hands where I can see them," Morrison commanded, his voice firm but betraying a hint of nervousness. The adrenaline coursing through him was undeniable, and it was hard to keep his tone steady. He had to remain in control. The man froze in place for a moment before turning around, his face a mixture of confusion and mild surprise. He held a protein shake in one hand and his phone in the other. "Officer, what's going on?" the man asked, his voice calm, his expression still puzzled. Morrison's grip tightened on his weapon, now pointing it downward but keeping it at the ready. "Put those down slowly," he ordered, his voice rising in volume. He wasn't taking any chances. The store clerk ducked behind the counter, panic written on his face, while an elderly woman near the magazine rack hurriedly exited the store. The tension in the air was thick, and Morrison knew that one wrong move could escalate things quickly. The man, still confused, began to lower the items in his hands. "Listen, there must be some mistake," he said, his tone even, his demeanor calm. "I'm just here to grab a snack after my gym session. I haven't done anything wrong." Morrison didn't respond immediately. He had made this mistake before, letting suspects talk their way out of situations, offering explanations that led him to second-guess himself. Not this time. Not when the stakes were so high. His training told him to act decisively and avoid any missteps. "On your knees, hands behind your head," he barked, cutting off the man's words. The suspect protested, but he complied, kneeling down slowly, his eyes scanning Morrison's face for any sign of mercy. "This is ridiculous," the man muttered, but Morrison wasn't listening. He had already moved in, roughly pulling the man's arms behind his back and cuffing him with a swift, practiced motion. The sound of the handcuffs snapping shut filled the otherwise silent store. Morrison stood up straight, his chest heaving with the rush of adrenaline, feeling the weight of his decision. The police station was buzzing with nervous energy. Officers scurried to handle various tasks, each of them aware of the gravity of the situation. Detective Morrison stood frozen in place, his face pale, the guilt and regret flooding over him in waves. Sergeant Thompson, his superior, approached with an angry look on his face. Without a word, he quickly moved to remove the handcuffs from the suspect's wrists. "Can I get you some water, Mr. Reynolds?" Thompson asked, his tone laced with both frustration and genuine concern. Michael Reynolds, the man Morrison had arrested, rubbed his wrists where the tight cuffs had left painful red marks. He took a moment before responding, his voice calm despite the situation. "Coffee would be better," he said, his tone measured. "And perhaps someone could call the school where I teach to let them know I'll be late for my first class." Morrison's stomach twisted. He had made a mistake, no more than that. He had arrested an innocent man, a teacher who just happened to be the chief's brother. The weight of his error grew heavier with every passing second, and the room seemed to close in on him. Lieutenant Garcia, the highest-ranking officer present, rushed out of his office, his face no longer friendly and warm, but stern, a look of worry etched into his features. "Mr. Reynolds, please come to my office," Garcia said, his voice calm but firm. "We need to sort this out immediately." As Michael Reynolds stood to follow Garcia, whispers filled the station. Officers who had, moments ago, nodded approvingly at Morrison now avoided his gaze. Some shook their heads in disappointment. "What do you think Chief Reynolds will do?" one officer whispered to another. "Morrison's career is over," came the reply. "You know how protective she is of her brother." Inside Garcia's office, Michael sat comfortably in a leather chair, looking more amused than angry. He seemed unbothered, almost detached from the gravity of the situation. Lieutenant Garcia sat across from him, while Morrison stood awkwardly by the door, unable to find the courage to speak. The shame was suffocating. "Mr. Reynolds," Garcia began, wiping the sweat from his forehead, "I cannot express how sorry we are for this incident. Detective Morrison was investigating an armed robbery case and made a regrettable error in judgment." Garcia paused as if searching for the right words, but there was no hiding the seriousness of the situation. Michael placed his coffee cup down on the table, his expression shifting to one of quiet frustration. "You mean he racially profiled me because I matched a vague description," Michael said, his words sharp. "A tall guy, athletic build, dark hair. That's it." Morrison flinched at the accusation, his throat tightening. I thought," he stammered, his voice faltering as Michael cut him off. "Let me tell you exactly what happened," Michael said, his voice even but filled with underlying tension. "I was getting a protein shake and some snacks after my morning workout. Next thing I know, I'm being treated like a dangerous criminal, handcuffed so tight that I might have bruises, driven here without any proper investigation." Lieutenant Garcia wiped the sweat from his forehead, his face tight with the stress of the situation. "We have your ID now. Obviously you're free to go. We'll be launching a full investigation into this incident." "That's good," Michael replied calmly. "Because when Sarah finds out..." The mention of Chief Sarah Reynolds made the room fall silent. The officers who had been talking quietly suddenly stopped, their eyes flickering nervously. Chief Reynolds was attending a law enforcement conference in Washington, D.C., but she would be back the next day. Morrison's heart skipped a beat. The chief, his superior officer, was about to find out about the mistake he had made. He couldn't bear the thought of her reaction. "Does she need to know about this?" Morrison asked, his voice trembling with uncertainty. Michael raised an eyebrow, his expression shifting to one of quiet amusement. "Are you suggesting we cover this up, detective?" he asked, his voice low and controlled. "That would be another mistake on your part." Lieutenant Garcia quickly intervened, his voice strained but resolute. "Of course not. We'll be fully transparent about this incident. In fact, I need to call the chief right now." "No need," Michael said, standing up and straightening his hoodie. "I'll call her myself. She should hear it from me first." Morrison felt the room spin. His career, which had taken him 6 years to build, seemed to be slipping through his fingers. The weight of his mistake was crushing. 6 years of police academy, patrol work, and finally earning the detective's badge, all of it potentially ruined because he couldn't wait for backup or properly identify the suspect. Morrison stepped forward, his voice shaking with remorse. "Mr. Reynolds, I truly apologize. I was wrong. Completely." Michael looked at him for a moment, his gaze steady and unblinking before he spoke again, his tone soft but pointed. "I hope you learn from this, detective. It could have been much worse." As Michael left the room, Morrison stood frozen, his heart sinking with the realization that he had just failed the very system he had sworn to serve. The long road ahead would be filled with consequences, but perhaps it was the price he had to pay to truly understand the gravity of his responsibilities as a law enforcement officer. Michael Reynolds looked at Detective Morrison for a long moment, the silence between them heavy with unspoken thoughts. Finally Michael spoke, his voice steady but laced with an edge of disappointment. "You know what's interesting, detective?" he began, his gaze piercing. "I teach criminal justice at the high school. I spend every day teaching young people about proper police procedures, constitutional rights, and the importance of fair treatment. Today you gave me a perfect real-life example of what not to do." Morrison's face flushed with guilt. He had expected a defensive reaction and angry outburst, but instead Michael's words hit him like a ton of bricks. He felt the weight of his mistake pressing down on him with increasing intensity. Michael continued, his tone unwavering. "I was buying a protein shake after my workout. That's all. And yet, you treated me like a criminal? He paused, taking a slow, deliberate breath. Oh, and you might want to check the security cameras at Peterson's liquor store. The robbery happened at 9:30 p.m. last night, and I was teaching an evening class about police accountability until 10 p.m. There were 20 students and another teacher who can verify that. The words stung. Morrison stood frozen, the realization of how badly he had messed up settling into his bones. Michael turned and walked toward the door but paused before leaving. He looked back at Morrison, his expression now one of quiet resolve. You should have done your homework before jumping to conclusions, Detective, Michael said calmly. I hope this will be a lesson for you. As Michael left the office, Morrison stood there, unable to move. His mind raced with shame, and for a moment he wondered if he would ever be able to recover from this. Lieutenant Garcia, who had been quiet throughout the exchange, sighed deeply. He picked up his phone, his hand shaking slightly as he dialed. He knew who he had to call and he dreaded it. The police station remained unnervingly quiet as officers gathered in small groups, whispers filling the air. Everyone was waiting to see how Chief Reynolds, Michael's sister and one of the most respected and feared figures in the department, would handle this debacle. Morrison could feel the weight of the uncertainty pressing down on him as he stood, staring at his badge. For a moment he wondered if he would still be wearing it by the end of the week. Karma had come for him in the most unexpected way, and its message was loud and clear. He had made a grave mistake and now he had to face the consequences. 2 hours after Michael Reynolds had left the police station, Detective Morrison sat at his desk, his eyes fixed on his computer screen. His hand trembled slightly as he reviewed the security footage from Peterson's liquor store. The truth hit him like a punch to the gut. The real robbery suspect was at least 30 pounds heavier than Michael and had a visible tattoo on his neck. The only features that matched were the suspect's height and general build, both of which were fairly common. Morrison felt his stomach churn with regret and self-loathing. He had acted on the weakest possible evidence, making a snap judgment that had cost him dearly. As he was still processing the devastating truth, Officer Jenny Chin appeared at his desk, holding a flash drive. Lieutenant Garcia wants the footage from Quick Stop, she said quietly, her voice soft but firm. Morrison nodded silently, his mind still reeling from the discovery. He pulled up the footage from the morning, his stomach turning as he watched himself storming into the store, weapon drawn, and manhandling an innocent man, Michael Reynolds, the chief's brother. The absurdity of the situation hit him all over again. The man he had arrested had been simply buying a protein shake after his gym session, and Morrison had treated him like a criminal. He felt the weight of his actions, the consequences of his rush to judgment, pressing on him. Jenny watched the screen with a sympathetic but concerned look. This doesn't look good, does it? She asked softly, her words a quiet acknowledgement of the disaster unfolding around him. Morrison didn't respond immediately, lost in the sickening realization of his mistake. How bad is it out there? He asked, his voice hollow, referring to the department's reaction to the arrest. Jenny hesitated for a moment, clearly uncomfortable with what she had to say. People are talking, she said quietly. Thompson pulled Michael Reynolds' file. Did you know he's won 3 Teacher of the Year awards? He runs the school's law enforcement career program. Half the cadets from last year's police academy were his students. Morrison's heart sank even further. Not only had he arrested the chief's brother, but he had also arrested a man who actively helped shape future police officers. The irony was almost painful. The man who had been teaching his students about the importance of accountability, fairness, and the law had become the victim of a fundamental breakdown in that very system. The weight of the mistake became almost unbearable. His phone buzzed, interrupting his spiraling thoughts. It was a text from his mother. I saw the news about your arrest on social media. Call me when you can. Morrison's stomach dropped. He opened his browser quickly and saw the video from Quick Stop already being shared on social media. The headlines were brutal. Police detective arrests chief's brother and makes major blunder. Another headline read, Teacher wrongfully arrested while buying post-workout snack. The viral nature of the incident felt like a public execution. His career, his reputation was crumbling in front of his eyes. He had become the subject of mockery and scorn, and there was no way to undo the damage. The door to Lieutenant Garcia's office opened abruptly, and Morrison was called inside. The officer felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him with each step. Garcia looked exhausted, his face drawn with the burden of what was unfolding. Files were spread across the desk, including Morrison's arrest records from the past 6 months. Sit down, Garcia ordered, his voice tight with frustration. Morrison's throat went dry. He knew what was coming. We need to talk about patterns, Garcia continued, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the records in front of him. Morrison's chest tightened. Patterns? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Yeah, in the last 6 months, you've made 43 arrests, Garcia said. 38 of them involved men matching Michael Reynolds' general description. Want to explain that? Morrison's defense was weak, and it sounded even weaker as Garcia threw a file on the desk, the thud of it echoing in the room. Really? Because 15 of those cases were dropped due to lack of evidence. 5 more are being reviewed right now, Garcia said, his voice rising in disbelief. How can you explain that? Before Morrison could respond, his phone buzzed again. It was another email from Michael Reynolds. His hands trembled as he opened it. Detective Morrison. I've attached security footage from my school showing me teaching class during last night's robbery. I've also attached student statements confirming my presence. These should help clear up any confusion regarding my whereabouts. Additionally, I'm forwarding you my teaching schedule for the next month. I'd like to invite you to speak to my criminal justice class about proper arrest procedures and the importance of thorough investigation. Consider it a learning opportunity for everyone involved. Regards, Michael Reynolds. Morrison looked up at Garcia, who had already seen the email. Garcia didn't look surprised but more disappointed. He's not pressing charges. Not yet, Garcia said, his voice flat. But his sister. As if on cue, the office phone rang. Garcia put it on speaker. Chief Reynolds' voice filled the room, and it was colder than any winter wind. I just watched some interesting footage from Quick Stop, she said, her tone as icy as her words. I'm cutting my conference short. I'll be there in 4 hours. Garcia responded quickly. Yes, Chief. Morrison felt a cold sweat break out across his back. He had been dreading this moment since the arrest. And Morrison? Chief Reynolds added, her voice carrying a chill that made him shiver. Don't leave the station. We need to have a long discussion about your future in this department. The line went dead and Morrison's stomach dropped. He looked at Garcia, his voice barely audible. What do I do now, sir? Garcia sighed deeply, looking at Morrison with a mix of disappointment and concern. First, you're going to pull every single arrest you've made in the past 6 months. Then you're going to review them all before the chief arrives. He paused before continuing, his voice softer but still firm. Morrison, start thinking about what kind of officer you want to be. Because after today, something has to change. Morrison nodded slowly, gathering the files with trembling hands. As he left Garcia's office, he could feel the eyes of his colleagues on him. Michael's email had already begun circulating around the department, and he could see the mix of anger, disappointment, and pity in their eyes. The next 4 hours would be the longest of his life. And when Chief Reynolds arrived, Morrison knew that his world was about to change forever. At exactly 4:30 p.m., Chief Sarah Reynolds walked into the police station, and the usual hum of activity came to a screeching halt. The officers who would normally greet her with smiles and small talk now stood frozen, watching her walk through the building with her face set in a tight, unreadable expression. She hadn't even stopped at home to change. She was still wearing the dark blue suit and sensible heels she had worn to the conference. Her presence was calm and composed, but it was the kind of calm everyone recognized as a signal of trouble. The click of her heels echoed through the silent station, amplifying the tension in the air as she walked toward the offices of Lieutenant Garcia and Detective Morrison. When she reached their doorway, she called out their names in a voice that was steady and unyielding. Lieutenant Garcia, Detective Morrison. My office now. Morrison stood slowly, his heart sinking. He glanced at Officer Jenny Chen as he rose, but she didn't say a word. Instead, she quietly whispered, "Good luck." Morrison didn't feel lucky. He felt like the weight of the world was on his shoulders. Inside Chief Reynolds' office, the silence was almost unbearable. She took her time settling into her chair, placing her phone on the desk in front of her. The screen flickered to life, showing the viral video of her brother's arrest. The footage played silently but clearly showed Morrison roughly handcuffing Michael Reynolds in the Quick Stop convenience store. Morrison sat down, his body tense, feeling like a schoolboy about to be punished. Garcia sat in the chair beside him, his face grim and unreadable. Chief Reynolds didn't waste time. I spent 2 hours on the phone during my drive back, she began, her voice eerily calm. First with the mayor, then with the police commissioner, and finally with my brother. She paused, letting the silence grow heavy. Michael being Michael, he wants to turn this into a teaching moment. Morrison sat still, his face burning with shame. He had expected anger, but instead, her words were laced with an unsettling calm. She looked directly at him, piercing him with her gaze. Do you know what he told me? She asked. Morrison shook his head, unable to find his voice. He said, Sarah, this is exactly why I teach criminal justice. To prevent future officers from making these mistakes, she continued. But here's the interesting part, detective. You're not a future officer. You're a detective with 6 years of experience. She leaned forward, opening a folder on her desk, and then turned her gaze back to him. I also spoke with Internal Affairs. They're very interested in your arrest record. Morrison felt his stomach drop. He could feel his career slipping away with each passing second, each sentence Chief Reynolds spoke. She wasn't finished yet. Let me tell you about my brother, she said, her voice still level. Every morning he goes to the gym at 5 a.m., then he stops at Quick Stop for his protein shake and snacks. He's been doing this for 5 years. The store owner knows him. The regular customers know him. A simple conversation with anyone there would have told you that this was routine for him. Morrison opened his mouth to speak, but Chief Reynolds cut him off. Last night, while you were suspecting him of armed robbery, he was teaching 20 students about proper police procedures. The irony of it is, it would be funny if it weren't so disturbing. Lieutenant Garcia shifted uncomfortably in his seat as the weight of the situation settled in. Chief Reynolds stood up and walked over to the office window, staring out for a moment before turning back to face them. Here's what's going to happen, she said, her voice now steely. Internal Affairs will conduct a full investigation into your past arrests. Until then you're suspended with pay. Morrison felt a slight wave of relief. At least he wasn't being fired immediately, but the reality was still sinking in. Chief Reynolds wasn't done. She picked up another piece of paper from her desk. My brother has made an interesting proposal, she said, her tone even. He wants you to attend his criminal justice classes twice a week during your suspension. You'll share your experience, including this incident, with his students. You'll learn from him about proper procedures, racial profiling, and community relations. Morrison blinked in surprise. He wants me to learn? Chief Reynolds nodded, her expression hardening. Yes. And to teach others what not to do. She set the paper down and met his gaze. It's either that, or I recommend immediate termination to the review board. Morrison didn't hesitate. He knew that this was the only option he had left. I'll do it, he said quickly. I'll attend the classes. Chief Reynolds studied him for a moment, her gaze unwavering. Good, she said finally, leaning back in her chair. Because Michael thinks you can learn from this. And despite everything, I trust my brother's judgment. She turned to Garcia, her voice firm. Lieutenant, implement immediate refresher training for all officers on arrest procedures. I want body camera reviews daily, and any arrest without proper probable cause will result in immediate suspension. Is that clear? Yes, Chief, Garcia replied, his voice firm and resolute. Now get out. Both of you, she ordered, turning to her computer. As Morrison stood and walked toward the door, her voice stopped him one last time. Oh, and Morrison, she called. He paused, turning back. My brother has more faith in you than I do right now, she said, her tone sharp. Don't make him regret it. Morrison nodded silently and left the room, the weight of her words heavy on his shoulders. He felt both relieved and terrified. His career had been saved, for now, by the surprising mercy of the man he had wrongly arrested. But he knew that the real test was just beginning. 1 week later, Detective Sarah Miller from Internal Affairs sat in a small conference room surrounded by stacks of files. Each file represented an arrest made by Detective Morrison over the past 6 months. As she flipped through them, the growing pattern became clear and her blood ran cold. This can't be a coincidence, she muttered under her breath, marking another troubling pattern in her notebook. The more she reviewed, the more the evidence pointed in a disturbing direction. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts, and Chief Reynolds entered, her face tired but determined. Tell me what you found, the chief said as she took a seat across from Miller. Detective Miller spread out several files on the table. It's worse than we thought, Chief, she said, her voice tense. Morrison's arrest pattern shows clear bias. Out of his last 50 arrests, 42 suspects matched your brother's general description. Tall, athletic build, dark hair. She pulled out more files, her eyes scanning them quickly. But here's where it gets interesting. 30 of these cases were dropped due to lack of evidence. The suspects were released within 24 hours. Chief Reynolds' face darkened. And nobody noticed this pattern before? That's another problem, Miller replied, her voice laced with frustration. Several officers filed complaints about Morrison's aggressive arrest tactics. All of these complaints went to Sergeant Brooks. Chief Sarah Reynolds frowned as she listened to Detective Sarah Miller's report. Where are these complaints now? She asked, her voice steady but tinged with frustration. Miller's expression turned grim. Buried. Brooks marked them all as resolved without investigation. He and Morrison graduated from the academy together. Just then, Officer Jenny Chin knocked and entered the room, holding a USB drive. Chief, you need to see this. We found security footage from other arrests Morrison made. Chin plugged the drive into a laptop and the screen came to life. The footage displayed multiple incidents showing Morrison aggressively approaching men who matched the same description. Tall, athletic build, dark hair, using questionable tactics and making arrests without clear probable cause. Officer Chin pointed out the time stamps, noting that most of these arrests occurred during Morrison's night shifts. Look at the timestamps, Chief. Most of these suspects were released by the morning shift before anyone would even see the reports. Chief Reynolds stood up, facing the room with her jaw clenched. So, Morrison made questionable arrests and Brooks covered for him? She asked, her voice hardening with each word. Miller checked her notes, the gravity of the situation weighing on her. 3 other officers regularly backed up Morrison during these arrests. They all worked under Brooks, she replied, her voice growing colder. It's a pattern of harassment hidden by friendly supervision. No wonder me brother's arrest went viral, Chief Reynolds muttered. It finally exposed everything. Officer Chin handed over more files. There's more, Chief. We found complaint letters from community members. Many described similar experiences, being stopped, searched, and sometimes arrested for doing normal things. Shopping, jogging, or leaving the gym. Just like Michael. Chief Reynolds nodded, picking up her phone and dialing quickly. Get me Lieutenant Garcia and Sergeant Brooks. Now. As they waited, Miller organized the growing evidence on the table. Chief Reynolds kept her focus sharp, processing everything that was happening. Chief, there's one more thing, Miller added. Morrison's arrest numbers spiked after his last performance review. Brooks gave him a poor rating for not being proactive enough. Minutes later, Lieutenant Garcia arrived alone. Chief Reynolds raised an eyebrow. Where's Brooks? Called in sick today, Garcia replied, his discomfort clear. Called in sick? Chief Reynolds repeated, raising her own eyebrows. Or running? Garcia shifted uncomfortably. His desk has been cleared out. Personal items are gone. The roof fell into a heavy silence as the implications settled in. Sergeant Brooks, knowing they would uncover his role in covering up Morrison's actions, had likely fled. Chin, Chief Reynolds ordered, her voice stern, put out an alert for Brooks. I want him found. Immediately. Turning to Miller, she said, How long will it take to complete the full investigation? 2 more weeks, Miller replied. We need to interview all the affected individuals, gather more evidence. It's going to take time. Chief Reynolds didn't hesitate. You have 1 week. The room went still. The community deserves answers sooner than that, she continued, her voice resolute. She stood by the window, watching officers below in the parking lot as her mind raced. My brother's wrongful arrest didn't just expose a detective's mistake. It cracked open a deeper problem in our department. One that allowed prejudice to hide behind badges and paperwork. We need to fix this. She turned back to face the team. Garcia, suspend the 3 officers who worked with Morrison, pending investigation. Miller, I want daily updates on your findings. Chin, work with community relations to reach out to everyone who filed complaints. We need to make sure their voices are heard. Chief Reynolds paused, her gaze piercing. And someone get me Morrison's current location. It's time he learned exactly what his actions were a part of. As the room emptied quickly, Chief Reynolds sat alone at the desk, her mind swirling with the weight of the decisions ahead. She picked up a complaint letter, reading it slowly. It was a poignant reminder of how much had been overlooked, ignored, or dismissed. Her brother's arrest hadn't just been a mistake, it had revealed a system-wide failure that had allowed these abuses to continue unchecked. The department meeting room had never been so full. Every available officer was present, sitting in silence as they awaited Chief Reynolds to speak. At the front of the room, a large screen displayed pictures and data from the internal investigation. Detective Morrison sat in the front row, his face pale and uncomfortable, his hands trembling slightly. He could feel the eyes of his colleagues on him, some filled with judgment, others with pity. Chief Reynolds stood at the podium, her expression serious. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. Today, she began, her voice steady, we're going to talk about trust. Trust that was broken, lives that were affected, and changes that must happen. She clicked to the first slide, showing Morrison's arrest statistics over the last 6 months. One detective made 50 arrests. 42 of those people looked similar, she said, pointing to the graph. 30 cases were dropped due to lack of evidence. This isn't police work. It's harassment. Morrison sank lower in his chair as his colleagues turned to look at him. He could feel their eyes boring into him, and it only deepened the shame that already consumed him. But this isn't just about Detective Morrison, Chief Reynolds continued, her voice gaining strength. This is about Sergeant Brooks, who covered up complaints. This is about officers who stayed silent when they saw wrong things happening. This is about a system that failed our community. The room remained silent as Chief Reynolds showed more slides, complaint letters, security footage, statistics, and more. My brother's wrongful arrest went viral, she said, pointing to the news coverage on the screen. But he wasn't the first innocent person Detective Morrison arrested. He was just the one who finally exposed everything. The door opened and Michael Reynolds walked in. He was dressed in his usual teacher clothes, a neat button-down shirt and tie. There was a sense of calm around him, a stark contrast to the tension in the room. Thank you for coming, Michael. Chief Reynolds nodded to her brother, who took his place at the podium. Would you like to share your thoughts? Michael looked around at the officers, some of whom avoided his gaze, others watching him curiously. He took a deep breath before speaking. I teach young people about law enforcement. I tell them that police officers protect and serve. I tell them about justice and fairness. He paused, glancing at Morrison. Was I wrong? No one answered. Detective Morrison arrested me while I was buying a protein shake, Michael continued. But at least I knew my rights. At least I had a sister who's the police chief. He turned to face Morrison directly. What about the others? The ones who didn't have these advantages? Morrison's voice trembled as he spoke. Sir, I'm sorry. Sorry isn't enough, Chief Reynolds cut in. She turned back to the screen and clicked to a new slide, showing a list of actions that would take place immediately. Which is why I'm announcing major changes effective immediately. Detective Morrison, suspended for 3 months, mandatory retraining. The 3 supporting officers, 2-week suspension, retraining required. And Sergeant Brooks. Chief Reynolds paused, her eyes narrowing. We'll deal with him once we find him. The room was silent as the reality of the situation began to sink in. The work ahead would be difficult, but the changes were necessary. The real work was just beginning. Sergeant Brooks had been terminated and was now facing criminal charges for misconduct. The room was heavy with tension as Chief Sarah Reynolds laid out the next steps. A new oversight committee was created to ensure that such mistakes would never be repeated. Body cameras must stay on during all interactions, she said firmly, her eyes sweeping over the officers. There will be monthly arrest reviews by an external committee, and community feedback sessions are now required. These changes are not optional. Her voice grew stronger as she continued. Additionally, every officer will attend new training sessions. These will be taught by my brother, Michael Reynolds, and his criminal justice students. The room was filled with murmurs. Having students teach experienced officers was unusual, unconventional even. Many officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of how to react. Some felt uneasy about the shift in authority, while others were skeptical about the involvement of someone so removed from their world. But Chief Reynolds' words were resolute. Some of you may not like these changes, she said firmly, her gaze locking on various officers in the room. There's the door. But if you stay, things will be different. Michael stepped forward again, his presence calm yet determined. Detective Morrison started his first training session in my class yesterday, he announced, his voice steady. He shared his mistake with my students. It wasn't easy, but it was honest. Morrison, who had been standing near the back of the room, nodded slowly. His first day teaching had been difficult, even humiliating, but it had been eye-opening. The experience of sharing his mistakes and learning from them had been a humbling one. He had come to understand that real change was not about making excuses but owning up to his past mistakes. Chief Reynolds took over the conversation. Changes start today, she said firmly, her voice echoing in the quiet room. Officer Chen will distribute new procedure manuals. Lieutenant Garcia will schedule your training sessions. Detective Miller from Internal Affairs will review all arrests from the past year, including those made by Detective Morrison. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle on everyone in the room. We wear badges to protect and serve everyone, not to harass, not to profile, not to abuse power. Those who cannot live up to this standard will be held accountable. The meeting ended, but the officers remained seated, processing the gravity of what had been said. Detective Morrison stood up and quietly approached Michael, who had been standing at the front of the room. Mr. Reynolds, Morrison said, his voice soft. Thank you. For teaching me. For giving me a second chance. Michael looked at him thoughtfully, his gaze steady but not unkind. Don't thank me yet, detective. Real change is harder than saying sorry. Are you ready for that? Morrison straightened his back, his shoulders squared. He looked Michael in the eye and nodded. Yes, sir. I am. As the officers finally began to leave the room, Chief Reynolds watched her brother speaking with Morrison. Her department would never be the same after this scandal, but maybe, just maybe, it would become better. Sometimes she thought it took a crisis to force necessary changes. Her brother's wrongful arrest had exposed deep problems within the department, but it also opened the door for real transformation. The hard work of rebuilding trust had only just begun. 3 months into his suspension, Detective Morrison stood nervously in front of Michael Reynolds' criminal justice class. Gone was his usual confident stance, replaced by a humbler presence. This class marked his 30th session of teaching, but this particular session felt different. Today, Michael announced to the class that Detective Morrison would be sharing something new, something that had happened just the day before during a community meeting. The students, who had grown used to Morrison's presence in the classroom, leaned forward in their seats. They had watched Morrison's transformation from a defensive, angry officer to someone who was slowly learning and changing. His journey was far from easy, but it had been sincere. The students were eager to hear more, to learn how the man who had once been one of the department's most problematic officers had begun to change. Last night, Morrison began, his voice steady but laced with emotion, I met with 5 people I wrongly arrested. People whose lives I affected with my poor decisions. He paused, gathering his thoughts. I want to share their stories with you. He clicked through the slides, showing photos of the people whose lives had been altered by his actions. This is James Carter, Morrison said, pointing to the first photo. I arrested him while he was jogging at night. Because of that arrest, he lost his job. He missed an important meeting the next morning. He let the words hang in the air as the students wrote in their notebooks, processing the impact of the story. Next, he moved on to Sarah Rodriguez, showing a picture of her and her family. I arrested her brother outside their family store, Morrison continued. Because of that arrest, their business lost customers. People were afraid to shop there after the incident. He paused again, his voice cracking slightly. These were real people. Their lives were impacted by my actions. Michael, watching from the back of the room, nodded encouragingly. He knew this was difficult for Morrison. But the fact that Morrison was willing to be honest about his mistakes, to show vulnerability in front of these students, was proof of his progress. The hardest part, Morrison admitted, wasn't facing their anger. It was seeing their fear. These people now fear the police. They fear people like me, people who should protect them. One of the students raised her hand, her voice curious. Detective, how did they react when you apologized? Morrison smiled sadly. They didn't trust me at first, he said. But then something amazing happened. He looked up at Michael, who stepped forward to finish the story. Mr. Reynolds stood up and shared my story with the community, Morrison continued. He talked about how I've been teaching here, learning from my mistakes, trying to change. Michael took over. And what happened next? He asked, turning to Morrison. James Carter, the jogger I arrested, he offered to join our community outreach program, Morrison said. He said that if I could change, maybe other officers could too. Another student spoke up. Is that why you're wearing the community liaison badge now? Morrison touched the new badge on his chest, which Chief Reynolds had given him. It symbolized his role in the new community outreach efforts that had been established within the department. Yes, Morrison said, his voice quiet but firm. But I had to earn it? Michael stepped forward once more. Detective Morrison's story teaches us something important, he said to the class. Change isn't just about saying sorry. It's about actions. He pulled up a slide showing new statistics that proved the changes were working. Since the changes in the department, wrongful arrests have dropped by 80%. Community trust scores have improved by 40%. The department is different now, he said. Morrison added, every arrest now needs proper evidence. Body cameras stay on. Community members are joining our training sessions. And most importantly, we listen. A knock on the door interrupted the class. Chief Reynolds entered, surprising everyone. Sorry to interrupt, she said, but I thought the class might want to hear some news. The class looked at her expectantly and she continued, Sergeant Brooks was arrested this morning in Nevada. Morrison straightened up. His former supervisor, who had been on the run for 3 months, would now face charges for misconduct and covering up wrongful arrests. Chief Reynolds turned to Morrison. Detective Morrison's testimony helped track his location. The class erupted in applause, but Morrison raised his hand for silence. Don't applaud, he said seriously. Brooks and I were both wrong. The difference is I got a chance to change. Thanks to Mr. Reynolds. The applause quieted, and the students took in the weight of his words. As Chief Reynolds looked at the room, she felt a sense of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something new, something better. Smiled. The difference is you took that chance, Detective. Chief Reynolds watched the interaction with a sense of satisfaction. Her brother had been right all along. Morrison wasn't beyond saving. He just needed the right guidance, a push toward accountability. Morrison, who had once seemed to embody all that was wrong with law enforcement, was now showing signs of real change. The fact that he had recognized his mistakes and committed to the difficult work of self-improvement made all the difference. Detective, Chief Reynolds addressed Morrison directly. Your suspension ends next week. The Community Liaison Unit needs a leader who understands both sides of the badge, someone who has experienced failure and learned from it. Morrison's eyes widened in disbelief, a mix of surprise and uncertainty flooding his expression. Chief, are you saying? She nodded firmly, a reassuring glint in her eyes. Report to my office Monday morning, she said. We'll discuss your new role. The room filled with murmurs as the other students congratulated Morrison, but he turned instead to Michael, his voice quiet but sincere. Mr. Reynolds, he said, thank you for not giving up on me that day at the quick stop. Michael patted his shoulder, offering a smile. Sometimes the best teachers are our own mistakes, Detective. You just have to be brave enough to learn from them. As the bell rang, signaling the end of the class, the students began packing up, but it was clear that something important had just taken place. They had witnessed the real transformation of a police officer who had come to understand the true meaning of protect and serve. 6 months later, the city's main conference hall was packed to capacity. The atmosphere was vastly different from the tense, uncomfortable days following the viral incident. Today, community members, police officers, students, and local leaders had gathered for a special presentation titled Transforming Police Community Relations: A Journey of Change. On stage, Detective Morrison stood, now wearing his new badge as the leader of the Community Liaison Unit, flanked by Michael Reynolds and Chief Sarah Reynolds. Michael stepped forward to the podium first, his voice calm and confident. 6 months ago, I was wrongly arrested while buying a protein shake, he began, a few chuckles rippling through the crowd as people recalled the viral video that had captured the moment. Today, I'm here to share how that moment changed not just one officer, but an entire police department. Behind him, the screen flashed statistics. Wrongful arrests down 90%, community trust up 75%, officer complaints reduced by 85%, and community participation in police programs increased by 200%. The numbers told the story of a department that had gone through a profound shift. A shift that was far from easy but incredibly necessary. Chief Reynolds took the microphone next, her tone steady but filled with the weight of reflection. When my brother was arrested, I was angry, she admitted, glancing briefly at Michael before turning her gaze to Morrison. I wanted to fire Detective Morrison immediately. But I'm glad I listened to my brother. Instead of rushing to judgment, we started a process of change. She stepped back, nodding for Morrison to take the stage. As he walked to the podium, his steps were confident but tempered by humility. The audience, many of whom had followed the viral arrest incident closely, hushed in anticipation. 6 months ago, I was the department's biggest problem, Morrison began, his voice steady but laced with genuine remorse. Today, I lead the Community Liaison Unit. But this isn't about me, it's about what happens when we admit our mistakes and truly commit to change. He clicked to the next slide, showing pictures of community events. Police officers playing basketball with teenagers, joining neighborhood cookouts, attending local festivals. Every officer now spends time in Mr. Reynolds' criminal justice class, Morrison continued, his eyes scanning the room. Not as teachers but as students. We learn from young people who see the world differently than we do. A young student stood up from the audience. Detective Morrison, she said, her voice bright with memory, remember when you first came to our class? You could barely look us in the eye. Morrison chuckled, a rueful smile on his face. Yes, I remember. I was ashamed. He paused, looking at the students before continuing. But you all taught me something important. It's okay to be wrong. As long as you're willing to learn and grow. Michael, standing at the podium beside Morrison, nodded. The changes weren't easy. Some officers resigned rather than adapt. Sergeant Brooks chose to run and now faces justice. But those who stayed, those who embraced change, they're creating a new kind of police department. Chief Reynolds stepped forward, holding up a document. Which is why, she said, Today I'm proud to announce our department's new Community First policy. Every decision, every arrest, every action must first consider its impact on the community we serve. The audience erupted in applause, moved by the announcement and the vision it represented. Chief Reynolds continued, "And who better to lead this initiative than the team that started it all? Detective Morrison and my brother, Michael, will co-chair our new Community Oversight Committee." Morrison's face showed surprise. This was new to him. He hadn't expected such a responsibility. But Michael grinned at him and shook his hand. "Sometimes," he said to the crowd, "the worst moments lead to the best changes. My wrongful arrest could have ended careers and deepened the divide between the police and the community. Instead, it built bridges." The presentation ended with a video montage. It showed Morrison teaching students, officers participating in community events, Chief Reynolds implementing new policies, and Michael working with both police and community members. The room was filled with a sense of accomplishment, of progress, of a department finally starting to make things right. As people began to leave, an elderly woman approached Morrison. He recognized her immediately. She had been at the quick stop the day of the arrest. "I saw everything that day," she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet strength. "I thought you were just another bad cop. But watching you change, watching you help change others, that's something special." Morrison felt a lump form in his throat. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We're trying to be better every day." Later, as the conference hall was being cleaned up, Michael turned to Morrison with a smile. "Ready for another class tomorrow?" Morrison grinned back. "Actually, I was thinking about your offer to get my teaching certificate. Maybe it's time I teach criminal justice too." Chief Reynolds, overhearing, laughed. "From wrongful arrest to teacher of justice? Now that's what I call karma." As they walked out together, the police chief, her teacher brother, and the detective who had learned the hardest lesson of his career, they knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter in police-community relations. Sometimes, the biggest mistakes lead to the most important changes. For Detective Morrison, what had started as a protein shake arrest had become a wake-up call that transformed not just his career, but his entire department's approach to justice and community service.